Hello, everyone. Today I'm speaking with Peter Adamson, professor of philosophy at the Ludwig Maximilians University in Munich, and one of the most engaging scholars working on the history of philosophy across the Islamic world, late antiquity, and beyond. He is the host of the hugely popular podcast, History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. Today, expect to learn about why Ibn Sina was one of the most original philosophers in world history and why thinkers like Ibn Rushd were far more than mere commentators on Aristotle. This is a conversation about how ideas travel, how civilizations preserve and transform knowledge. If you enjoyed this discussion, please subscribe or follow on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple. Please also leave a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps this channel reach more people. More conversations are on the way, and following the channel is the best way to get notified about them. You can reach out to me on every social media platform with links included in the description. Now, here's my interview with Peter Adamson. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, so before we get into Plato, Aristotle, Ibn Sina, and Ibn Rushd, and all the rest of the interesting stuff, I want to start with the label itself. So when we say Islamic philosophy, what does that phrase reveal, and what does it risk hiding?
I actually don't usually say that phrase. I don't usually use Islamic philosophy. I used to say Arabic philosophy. I was one of the two editors of the Cambridge Companion to Arabic Philosophy, in fact. But over time, I sort of gravitated towards saying philosophy in the Islamic world. And maybe I can just explain why. So previously, there were two options. There's Arabic philosophy, Islamic philosophy, and they both have minuses, maybe some pluses, but basically minuses. I mean, I guess the best thing about them is they're brief, so it's a little bit less unwieldy than philosophy in the Islamic world. The phrase Arabic philosophy, I think, highlights the fact that we're talking about texts that were written in Arabic. There's already a slight problem with the fact that people often get confused because they don't grasp that Arab and Arabic are different words. So they think Arabic philosophy means Arab philosophy, and then they say, oh, but a lot of these people weren't Arabs. That's just silly. That's just not knowing what the English word Arabic means. So I think we could sort of put that aside. But there's a bigger problem, which is that there's a lot of philosophical works in this tradition which are not in Arabic. So especially there are quite a few in Persian. There's also Syriac, Hebrew. So that's problematic. And then Islamic philosophy has a similar problem, which is that a lot of the philosophers we are or should be interested in here are Christians and Jews, even occasionally Zoroastrians, but mostly it's about Christians and Jews. And they write in Arabic, they write about philosophy, they live in Muslim territories. So it just seems kind of crazy to call someone like Maimonides a representative of Islamic philosophy because he's the greatest Jewish philosopher and theologian in history. So that I think that's in a way almost a non-starter unless you wanted to exclude Christian and Jewish thinkers from the field, which I don't. And I don't think anyone should want to do that. So for that reason, I, and not just I, but actually quite a few people in the field have started saying philosophy in the Islamic world. And the idea there is that Islamic world is just supposed to refer to a geographical space, basically the lands where Islam is the dominant religion, at least politically dominant. Actually, in some, especially early on, for example, in Spain, in parts of the Middle East, Christianity remains the majority religion for quite a long time after the rise of Islam. But even so, we can say that like Syria in, let's say, the 10th century counts as part of the Islamic world, even though there are more Christians than Muslims, because the rulers are Muslim, right? So that's basically what we're talking about is the area philosophy in the areas where Islam is culturally and or politically dominant. And that means that we're starting in, let's say, the 8th century and moving up to now. So that's the field.
What is it about Arabic that is important here? Does Arabic language play the same role of Latin language that played the role in the medieval Europe, or are we talking about something else here?
No, that's a very good analogy, actually. In fact, quite a few of the philosophers in the period we'll be talking about, for example, Ibn Sina, who I'm sure we'll say a lot about as we go along, he would have been a native Persian speaker, but he wrote almost entirely in Arabic for the same reason that, Thomas Aquinas didn't grow up speaking Latin at his mother's knee, but he wrote everything he wrote in Latin. So it's a very similar situation. I mean, it's maybe a little bit different, though, in that Latin in the Middle Ages is already a kind of antique language, right? So nobody speaks Latin natively in the 13th century, right? It's only a language of the schools. And so there's a sort of explicit reference back to Rome, etc. I mean, they lost their grip on Latin as a living language to the point that in the Renaissance, there was even a debate about whether the Romans actually spoke Latin because they couldn't imagine people in the street speaking this refined literary language of Cicero, right? I think that's very funny, actually. Whereas Arabic, obviously, you have Arabic speakers, right? And you have native Arabic speakers right up through the whole period that we're talking about. A lot of these people would have been bilingual, but Arabic is absolutely a living language, and it competes with Persian for cultural supremacy from early on. So there's that difference, but still Arabic becomes, as it were, the lingua franca of all literature in the Islamic world, although Persian does become increasingly used, for example, for philosophy as of like maybe about the 13th century.
Yeah, so if we zoom out and take a look at this geography in the Middle Ages, it seems like, okay, we have one big empire, but within that empire, we have different religions, Christians, Jews, Muslims, different languages being spoken of. And so in what ways this is something new versus just a collection of different cultures preserving ancient philosophy versus something original being created in this geography?
Yeah. I mean, one thing, just a kind of caveat, is that actually the territory we're talking about is really never under a single empire, because even when the Abbasid Empire arises and takes everything from basically the modern Middle East over to Central Asia, you still have the remnant of the Umayyad Empire over in Spain and North Africa. And actually, the Abbasid Empire doesn't maintain an imperial grip on even that territory that it holds at first for more than a couple of centuries. And after that, you have a much more fragmented political situation. And later on, you get the rise of actually three imperial powers, so the Ottomans, the Safavids, and the Mughals. So it's actually very complicated the whole time, right? That's actually important because it means that when we talk about philosophy in the Islamic world, we're basically never talking about philosophy that's happening within a single political entity. We're always talking about multiple political entities, all of which are united by Islam, but maybe not even the same conception of Islam, right? So, for example, the Ottomans are Sunnis, the Safavids are Shiite, and so on. Okay, but with that caveat, so I think what is new here, first of all, is Arabic, right? So it's because of the spread of Islam that Arabic spreads and becomes the literary language. So that's one thing. That's an obvious thing. I mean, whenever you're reading philosophy in Arabic, it's because Islam brought Arabic to the people who are writing in it. So that's one thing. But then the other thing would be that many of these philosophers are in one way or another thinking about the relationship between Islam as a religion and philosophy. And what philosophy might mean there is a bit of a moving target. But if you think of the most obvious thing, which we'll talk about in a minute, the reception of Greek philosophy in Arabic, there's from the very beginning with someone like Al-Kindi, who's 9th century, there's already a concern about, well, how are we going to either reconcile philosophy with Islam, or in his opinion, actually, you can use philosophy to basically prove that Islam is true, or at least major commitments within Islam. For example, the unity and oneness of God. So, yeah, so there's that. I mean, again, the philosophers who are writing in Arabic are often Christians and Jews. So it's not like everyone we're thinking about is worried about Islam, except maybe as an opponent. But by the same token, they are surrounded by, if not a majority Muslim population, at least a very, well-established Islamic intellectual culture, which means that someone like Maimonides is thinking a lot about Muslim authors who write about philosophy and theology and so on. He refers to them explicitly. An earlier Jewish philosopher, Saadia Gaon, is often thought to be basically taking views from Islamic theology and importing them into Judaism. So there's a lot of mixing and matching of ideas, and Islam, just because of its dominance, is sort of the controlling ideology within which philosophy unfolds.
Yeah, I think I've read in Bertrand Russell's History of Western Philosophy that the thinkers and philosophers in the Islamic world were better known as great commentators versus original thinkers. So I would like to get your opinion on that. Like, is that a mischaracterization, or is there some truth to that?
Yeah, I mean, this is something that's often quoted from Russell's history because it's like, you could argue it's the single stupidest thing he ever said, right? Like, it's so wrong that you're just like, wow, like, how could someone that smart have said something that stupid, right? And people love to quote it because it's so dumb, right? And I mean, I think on the one hand, you could say, well, it's stupid only in the sense of being ignorant. So like he didn't know what he was talking about, obviously. I think you could say, I mean, I know you're not asking me to defend Russell or to judge Russell, but I always do think it's a little bit unfair when people quote this, because as they always do, because he had no idea what he was talking about, basically. So he was working from some Orientalist 19th century scholarship on philosophy in the Islamic world, which was very badly informed, almost completely based on what was available in terms of translations from Arabic into Latin and so on. I mean, it has to be said that even if all you could read was like translations of Ibn Sina into Latin under the name of Avicenna, then already, you know, if you spend 5 minutes reading that, you can say, oh, this guy's not a commentator and he's an incredibly interesting philosopher. So I think probably it would be fair to say that Bertrand Russell spent less than 5 minutes actually reading the primary texts. So that's not great, but you know, it's a kind of throwaway line. But I mean, it's about as intelligent as saying there's no such thing as Chinese philosophy. It's like, okay, well, you just haven't thought about this at all. So I mean, with no disrespect to your question, it's not really a very good place to start because it's so badly informed and so far away from anything we're worrying about now. I mean, we're worried about much different things now. So nowadays we worry more about, you know, is Ibn Sina's philosophical system in dialogue with Islamic theology or something like that? We don't worry about whether these guys were interesting and original philosophers because the answer is just like, obviously, yes, just pick up a book and read for 5 minutes and you'll see that they are.
Yeah, I think, I mean, I see it more and more when I look at, for example, Western philosophy, Chinese, Islamic, Indian, the more or less the thinkers and philosophers touch upon the similar issues, but from the different angles. So you have people in Indian philosophy talking about consciousness, and you see that they are saying the same thing that Descartes said. So we can say they are commenting on Descartes, but maybe it's just that different cultures reach to the same conclusion because of the natural curiosity that we all have.
Yeah, I think you actually see three things. So one is that. So you have someone in another culture independently raising the same question and coming to the same answer. That's actually pretty rare. And it's in a way the least interesting thing, right? Because you already had Descartes saying that. So who cares if some Indian guy said it too? Okay, he's earlier. I mean, you could say, well, who cares that Descartes said it because some Indian guy said it first, right? But in a way, philosophically, that's the least interesting thing. But that's unusual. The more usual thing is either they're asking the same philosophical questions, but coming up with different answers, right? So, for example, you have Vedanta monism, right? Which is, okay, it's monism like Parmenides and Spinoza, but it's very, very different from Parmenides and Spinoza. So it's like in the same family of monist philosophical views, but it's not the same beyond the kind of sort of generic similarity. And then maybe the most interesting thing is that you have philosophical debates about things that either don't arise in European philosophy or don't get prioritized or emphasized as much. So my favorite example of this is that Confucian ethics has as its central concept ritual, li, which is not a central concept in European ethics in any European ethical tradition. But once you start digging into it, you see, oh, okay, this is like a whole philosophical theory that's based around the concept of ritual. And once you take that seriously, you see that there is this sort of third option where you can recognize something as a philosophical agenda or project or question, even though they're not saying the same thing. In the case of what we're talking about today, philosophy in the Islamic world, I think it would be fair to say that it's more like we're seeing similar questions with different answers and sometimes with the same answers, in part because like they're reading Aristotle, right? So often they will repeat Aristotle's answer and modify it a bit, but they will also come up with different answers to the same questions. I think there's maybe not too many things in philosophy of the Islamic world that are as it were, foreign or completely sort of mind-bending as what you would find in India and China. But that's not surprising because there's a historical link between philosophy in the Islamic world and Greek philosophy, whereas there isn't, or there's very little in the case of India and China.
Yeah, I'm glad we already started talking about these topics. And after Russell's comment on Russell, okay, you mentioned Aristotle, and Ibn Rushd has been characterized as one of the great commentators on Aristotle. So, what can we say about what Ibn Rushd contributed to Aristotle's philosophy?
Right. Okay. So Ibn Rushd lives in Muslim Spain in the 12th century. And I think actually Russell probably would have had him primarily in mind. So when Russell said they're just commentators, what he's thinking is, well, we know that there are all these commentaries on Aristotle by Ibn Rushd, who was called Averroes in Latin. And the medievals seem to keep referring to Avicenna, so Ibn Sina, when they're talking about Aristotelianism. So basically, they must be just Aristotelian commentators. I think that's actually why Russell said this. And it's true, actually, that Ibn Rushd's project is primarily a project about commenting on Aristotle. And that's extremely unusual in the Islamic world. So I think he's probably the single thinker whose project most revolves around Aristotle in the entirety of the tradition. There is Al-Farabi, who also is very interested in Farabi, and there's some other Aristotelians around the time of Farabi who were his colleagues and teachers and students and so on. We call them the Baghdad school. They're mostly Christians, by the way, to go back to something I was saying earlier about there being Christian philosophers in this tradition. But Ibn Rushd really is like a hardcore Aristotelian. So he is really picking up the mantle of certain commentators from late antiquity, like Alexander of Aphrodisias, and he is addressing himself to interpretive questions about Aristotle by writing a series of commentaries. Actually, their commentaries may be a little bit misleading. So a lot of what he's writing is epitomes, in other words, like short summaries of Aristotle's works, or paraphrases, which just kind of say, well, here's the basic idea. And then he does, for a few of the most important works, write full commentaries where he quotes the Arabic translation of Aristotle, and then he gives you a whole commentary on each passage. But he only did that for, I think, 4 works. So that's not, so maybe it's a little bit misleading to talking about him as a commentator in that sense, but he's an exegete of Aristotle for sure. But he actually, even Ibn Rushd, despite all this, like intense engagement with Aristotle, that's really his life's project. He also writes a bunch of things that are not exegetical works on Aristotle. And in fact, his most famous work is not about Aristotle, at least not directly. It's about the role of philosophy in Islam. And he's defending the idea that Muslims should engage in philosophy, to make a long story short. And he uses Aristotelian philosophy to do this, but this is like a project that goes well beyond merely explaining what Aristotle said.
Yeah. So why would, let's say, a thinker living in the Islamic world would care about Aristotle or Plato or Greek philosophy in general? Because if you look at, for example, the religion that they had, Islam is kind of a total, in a sense, that covers every aspect of life. So what is missing in that geography that thinkers would go and look into these alternative ways of life, philosophies, ethics?
Right. That's a big and difficult question. I'm not sure that it's possible to answer it for everyone who's interested in Aristotle. Maybe the first thing to say about this is that there's a word in Arabic, which is falsafa, which, as you can hear, is based on the Greek word philosophy, or philosophia, right? The Greek word philosophy. And it means not exactly philosophy, but something more like philosophy done in the style of Aristotle. And then after Ibn Sina, because Ibn Sina is so influential, it comes to mean philosophy done in the style of Ibn Sina. Okay. So in a way, the question is, why does falsafa exist, right? So why do we have this Aristotelian and then Avicenna approach to doing philosophy? Why does it have so much resonance? And actually, one thing to say about this would be maybe that it actually has a lot less resonance than we often think, because it's a pretty niche enterprise. So, I mean, like I said, Ibn Rushd is really the only person whose entire sort of intellectual project centers solely around the interpretation of Aristotle, and even his project doesn't solely center around that, as I was just saying, right? And we're not talking about all that many people. I mean, the falsafa, like the real hardcore Aristotelians between the 9th and the 12th century, we're probably not talking about more than a couple of hundred people. Okay. So actually, the main philosophical tradition in the Islamic world at this time is kalam, which means Islamic theology or philosophical theology. And so we can talk about that too if you want. But that's a much more culturally important and sort of culturally present phenomenon than falsafa. Falsafa is sort of a nerdy thing that these people do who love the Greeks. Okay. So then the question would be, why do these nerds love the Greeks so much? And there, I think it shifts. So the initial answer is that Al-Kindi and people who think like him, they believe that you can use Greek philosophy to support Islamic religious doctrine, or actually often Christian religious doctrine, because the Christians who write in Arabic are doing the same thing, but they'll use Aristotelianism to defend a certain reading of the Trinity, for example. So that's sort of the first move. I think also Kindi was just so kind of bound up with the translation movement and that whole project that he just was trying to promote the idea to his rich patrons and convince them that they should be paying for more translations as part of what he's doing. So anyway, the kind of initial move is, oh, look at all this Greek philosophy. We can use this for our own purposes. It also comes along with the transmission of other scientific disciplines like medicine, especially, but also mathematics. And so it kind of has a value that it inherits from these more obviously useful sciences. So the people who are specialists on falsafa are often also specialists in Greek medicine, like Galen in particular. Okay, so that's sort of the first thing that happens. And then after there's sort of initial engagements with that, we get to Ibn Sina, who lives from the late 10th into the first third of the 11th century. So he dies in 1037. And with him, we have something completely different. So he sort of takes a step back, rethinks the entire philosophical inheritance, considers a lot of the problems that are being discussed in kalam as well, also knows a lot about medicine. He stirs that all together, pours in a very generous helping of his own ideas, and then creates this new system that even has, to some extent, new terminology in it. And he does all these new things like a new proof of the existence of God and so on and so forth, new conception of the soul, you name it, new logic, completely reworks Aristotle's logic. So we have one of the most innovative and pioneering philosophers in world history is Ibn Sina, and that changes everything. So after that, there's sort of two ways you can go. One is to just forget about the Greeks and start engaging with Ibn Sina. And basically everybody does that, especially in the East. So in post-Avicennan philosophy, you basically have people accepting and defending Ibn Sina or attacking him from various points of view, and maybe not overall, but even on certain topics. So you might agree with him about one thing with him, you might disagree with him about something else. Okay, so very, very complicated philosophical landscape that's all shaped by Ibn Sina's philosophy. And that kind of, in some ways, like directly or indirectly, that kind of goes down to something like the 19th century. So that's the next 800 years or something, is like broadly Avicenna in the broadest possible sense. Like he really shapes the agenda for a long, long time. Sort of the way that Aristotle shapes the agenda in medieval philosophy, in Latin medieval philosophy, I mean. So that's one option. So just kind of stop thinking about Aristotle, start thinking about Ibn Sina. But they're still calling that falsafa, right? Okay.
So, yeah, just to lay out the map here. So at the one hand, we have kalam, which is basically Islamic theology, scholars debating the interpretation of the religious texts and everything. So that's one part of the story. And then we have falsafa, or this additional extra step where we go and look for all these ancient texts from Greek world, make commentaries on them, expand on them, or is this a good representation of what's happening there?
Yeah, I think you can say that's what's going on up until Ibn Sina. So you have this like this development of rational theology, kalam, and you have this smaller group of people who are engaging with the Greek text. That's falsafa. And one of the things that Ibn Sina does, which makes him so influential, is that he fuses the two. So he uses tools of falsafa to answer kalam problems and vice versa. Okay.
Yeah, let's go into deeper to that.
Well, actually,
yeah.
One second. I didn't do the other option yet.
Yeah.
So the other option, so the first option is just think about Ibn Sina. The second option is say, no, Ibn Sina is a disaster. We should never have moved away from Aristotle. And that's Ibn Rushd. So Ibn Rushd, who after all lives like a full century after Ibn Sina. So he doesn't die until 1198, right? So he's even more than a century after Ibn Sina. And his project is to return to the Greeks in a way and say, this is an error. We should never have like moved away from this. We should go back to like real Aristotle. And that's why he's got this almost like pedantic level of fascination with like every single word that Aristotle wrote, because he's trying to get back to like the original wisdom of the Greeks. But as I say, that's a pretty unusual project, and it's not a project that was of much interest in the Islamic world. So the point I'm making is that, because you asked like, why are they interested in the Greeks? And there's three answers in a way that I gave you. Al-Kindi and other people early on, like Farabi, what they want to do is integrate Greek philosophy with some kind of conception of Islam. Second answer is Ibn Sina. I'll take your ideas and completely revamp them and come up with my own system. And the third option is Ibn Rushd, which is this kind of conservative project of reconstructing and reasserting Aristotle in backlash against Avicennism.
Okay, that's very interesting because, so if you look at the historical trajectory of how Ibn Sina and how Ibn Rushd was perceived, because as far as I know, Ibn Rushd wasn't that even known in the Islamic world and was known in Europe the most. But in the other hand, you have Ibn Sina, which has been very, very famous.
Actually, I have a colleague who's working on the later Persian reception of Ibn Rushd, which turned out to be surprisingly ample.
Okay.
But I was really surprised when he told me that. But broadly speaking, yeah, his impact amongst Jewish and Christian philosophers is much larger than his impact amongst Muslim scholars.
But it's the exact opposite in the case of Ibn Sina. Yes, we have Ibn Sina, which has been more known.
Yeah, I mean, Ibn Sina is influential in both, right? So he's both one of the major sources for Latin medieval philosophy, and he is the major source for later philosophy in Arabic and Persian.
Okay, what's so original in Ibn Sina's philosophy?
Well, kind of everything, right? So, I mean, he writes a vast amount, and he deals with every single area of philosophy and reconsiders it. There's always some kind of relationship to what Aristotle had been doing, but he is open in rejecting Aristotle's positions as either wrong, or more usually he'll reject them as like not fully satisfactory. So a good example would be what he says about the soul. So he says, well, Aristotle defines the soul as the form of the body. And that's not really, I mean, that's not wrong exactly, because the soul does provide the body with its structure and so on, and perfection, as he says. But the soul isn't in itself the form of the body. The soul is a separate substance, which is immaterial. And then he wants to prove that, right? So he, in that case, really sort of says, well, Aristotle, in a way, got the wrong end of the stick here when talking about the soul. He redoes metaphysics a lot, builds it around the concept of existence, which is not really something that Aristotle had gotten into at all. Like I said, he completely revamps Aristotle's logic and does, I mean, this gets kind of technical, but he has this amazing thing where he manages to expand Aristotle's logic to handle the sorts of logical inferences that don't appear in Aristotelian logic, but do appear in Stoic logic. So I don't know if you want to get too much into this, but just for example, the Stoics have analysis of hypothetical syllogisms like if A, then B, A, therefore B, right? So a very simple argument structure. You can't do that in Aristotle's logic because Aristotle's logic is always about predication. So all A's are B's, all B's are C's, therefore all A's are C's, that kind of thing. And what Ibn Sina does is he says, well, but you could think about a hypothetical syllogism as in terms of predication, like if A is said, so if A is said of all B, then C is said of all D, and A is said of all B, therefore C is said of all D, right? So you've integrated Aristotelian logic into the Stoic logic, basically. It's obviously much more complicated than that. But basically what he does is he completely expands Aristotle's logic to handle a whole range of different kinds of inferences that Aristotle's logic wouldn't have been able to accommodate. He also writes about medicine. And in fact, in today's Islamic world, he's more famous as a doctor than as a philosopher, which is quite weird, actually. So, I mean, it would be like if Mick Jagger were more famous as a fashion designer than a rock singer, right? Like Mick Jagger was interested in fashion, yes, but yeah, actually, that's a good comparison. I think I'm going to remember that and use it in the future. It's exactly like that. So he writes about medicine. He writes this one work on medicine, which is extremely influential, also in Latin, but it's not his primary vocation. So basically, he's just innovating just across the board. He's not that innovative when it comes to ethics and political philosophy, but other than that, he's really like an astoundingly creative and productive philosopher. He's sort of like Kant. So if you think of the role of Kant in modern philosophy and German philosophy, that's sort of Ibn Sina's role in philosophy of the Islamic world. He's the big event.
There is something about these polymaths, yeah, that I believe because when you say, okay, I want to study something, okay, what can I study? Philosophy or falsafa. That is basically everything about science. It is medicine, zoology, philosophy as we know it today. And we see this tendency in Greeks and then later on with Ibn Sina and even someone like Leonardo da Vinci versus what we have today, where we are kind of specialized in very specific fields.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting phenomenon, right? So it's really a striking feature of pre-modern philosophy that they're often also scientists, doctors, and so on. Plus, they do all the different kinds of philosophy, a lot of them. And that's, as you say, that's like in very strong contrast to today, where you can't even just be an expert on medicine. You have to be an expert on some tiny little area of medicine, right? But that's just because the fields have become so professionalized and so advanced that there's too much to know, right? I mean, I'm a historian of philosophy with very broad interests, but I don't know about the whole history of philosophy by any means. To say nothing of all the fields of contemporary philosophy, with some of those I have some familiarity, but like I know a lot less of than half the philosophy there is to know, even in history of philosophy, and I've been doing it for, I don't know, 35 years or something. So
I've seen some internet memes where on the one hand you have all these ancient polymaths where it says, okay, I studied medicine, I discovered political philosophy, I wrote politics, zoology, and everything, and on the right hand you have today's professor where it says I am expert in tax laws in Prussia in 1865. So you can see that.
Yeah. But I mean, you could think of that as a sign of success, right? So it's the fact that there's so much to know about each of these little subfields that makes it possible and necessary for people to specialize in that. And then there are some people who are trying to do these like bigger projects, like my podcast, for example, which is trying to cover all of history of philosophy and the history of humankind, right? Which is kind of a ridiculous thing to do. But I mean, I'm not doing that at a huge level of depth, of course, right? Because to do that would be even more impossible. And I'm just doing the thing that's sort of impossible, not the thing that's like profoundly impossible.
We will come to your podcast towards the end, but sticking with the Ibn Sina, can we talk a little bit more about this floating man thought experiment? So, what is Ibn Sina really trying to show here?
Right. This goes back to something I mentioned before, which is his critique of Aristotle's theory of soul. So what he does is he criticizes that theory, and then he says, well, really all you've managed to do here is describe the soul via an accidental connection it has to a body. Okay. But as I said, there's nothing intrinsic about the soul that says it has to be connected to a body because it can survive without the body. Right. So we need a better way to grasp what the soul is in itself. So how about this? And then he proposes this thought experiment, which is often called the flying man thought experiment. Sometimes people say floating man, as you just did, because flying sounds like he's moving. But the point is that he's sort of hovering in midair. Okay. Because there shouldn't be any wind. That's why you don't want him to be moving like Superman. Okay. So the idea is God creates a fully mature human, and all of the human's faculties are functioning perfectly. It could be a woman, but let's say it's a man because people always say flying man. So Ibn Sina says this man is created with his sight veiled, so that there's nothing that he can see. There's no sound. The air is not moving. There's no smell. Obviously, he's not eating, so he can't taste anything. And the reason why he's up in the air and also his arms or his limbs have to be splayed out, the reason for that is that he can't be touching anything. Because if he was on the ground, he'd be touching the floor and he'd feel something, right? Okay. So then Ibn Sina says this flying man would have no access to anything via his senses. The idea is complete sensory deprivation. That's the point of the thought experiment. So what would he know? Well, he would still know that he exists. So then his claim is that this shows that what the flying man really is, his self, if you will, must be distinct from his body because he's aware of his self, but he's not aware of his body. Why is he not aware of his body? Well, because you can only access bodies through the senses, right? And he doesn't have any sensation. I mean, he has a power of sensation, but he's not using it, right? And he's never used it because he was only just created, right? He can't remember having a body. He's only just been created. So the idea is that because he has like this access to himself, but he has no access to his body, his self and his body must be distinct. That's the argument. And people love this. So it's like a lot of fun to teach. And there's lots of argument about how it works and whether it works and what exactly he's trying to prove. But that's the basic idea.
So in a way, I can think of my mind independent of my body, and I can also think of my body independent of my mind. So very similar to mind-body distinction that Descartes talked about.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And in fact, Descartes makes a similar move. So people often compare it to the cogito, I think, therefore I am, which is wrong, because the point of the cogito is to show that there's something that survives skeptical attack. And Ibn Sina is not talking about that at all. But it is very much like something that happens later in the Meditations where Descartes says that we have like one kind of concept that applies to the soul and another kind of concept that applies to the body. And what's essential to the soul excludes reference to the body. So similarly, Ibn Sina wants to say that what's essential to the soul or the self excludes the body, because if it involved the body, the flying man wouldn't be able to grasp it without grasping his body. That's the point.
Is it a counter argument against Aristotelian idea of one essence, or no?
No, I don't think so. I mean, I think, like I say, he says that. Well, there's two things. There's Aristotle's view of soul and his view of essence, which are different, right? So his view of soul is that soul is form of the body. And as I've said, Ibn Sina says, well, no, not really. It's the soul, maybe the source of the body's form, right? But it's not an immanent form in the body, because if it, like the shape of a table is in the table, right? It can't be like that. But actually, as far as essence goes, I mean, it depends what you think is going on in the argument, but as I read it, he's actually using Aristotle's conception of essence, because he's saying that the flying man grasps himself as such in what he really essentially is without grasping the body, which shows that the body or relationship to the body is only accidentally related to him, right? So in himself, he's not a bodily thing, but he might have an accidental relationship to a body.
Okay, Ibn Sina. So, what was Al-Ghazali really attacking? Okay, maybe this is another common understanding that we can address here, that Al-Ghazali was the one against rationalism, and he really started to crack the rational trajectory that Islamic world was going forward, and then he came and put on a stop. So, do you think this is a correct way to read the history, or is there something else that we are missing here?
Yeah, I think that's a lot closer to being incorrect than correct, let's say. I mean, Ghazali is a very complicated figure, and he's drawing on Ibn Sina's falsafa, but also kalam and Sufism. And these are sort of mixed together in some kind of very complicated package. And people argue a lot about exactly where the center of gravity is for Ghazali. But one way to think about him is that he's attacking Ibn Sina from a more or less kalam point of view. And in particular, he belongs to this school of kalam called Asharism, which is hard to square with Avicennism in various ways, right? So he writes this book called Tahafut al-Falasifa, which means the incoherence of the philosophers, or doesn't quite mean that, but that's how people always translate it. And this is an attack on certain aspects of Ibn Sina's thought, especially the metaphysics. So his conception of God, his idea that the universe proceeds necessarily and eternally from God, his way of talking about miracles and basically ruling out that they could happen, and so on. So that's what it's about. One thing that people tend to forget is that it's quite a selective list of targets. So, for example, elsewhere, Ghazali says explicitly that you should accept logic as a useful thing to study, and he really means Ibn Sina's logic. So, people follow him on this. So, logic becomes like one of the main things that people do at the madrasa over the succeeding centuries. The madrasa system was actually founded by a vizier named Nizam al-Mulk in the time of Ghazali. And so logic is just at this time sort of bedding in as a major educational tool for later Islamic world. Again, very much like Latin scholasticism, where everyone has to start with logic when they go to the universities, right? But this is a little bit earlier than the Latin universities. Ghazali, by the way, I think we didn't say that Ghazali dies in 1111, which is easy to remember and shows you that we're about 100 years before the founding of the universities in Europe, which happens in the late 12th century, right? So Ghazali writes this selective critique of Ibn Sina, and this goes on to be very controversial. So, for example, in the Ottoman Empire, people write works in which they're comparing Ghazali's incoherence to the incoherence of the incoherence, Tahawul Tahafut, which was written by Ibn Rushd as a kind of rebuttal of Ghazali's rebuttal of Ibn Sina. And so there are these Ottoman works where people are trying to take sides and say who's right, which was pretty interesting. So, I mean, I think there's maybe two things that are misleading about the way people often think about Ghazali. One is that they tend to think of him as a just across the board critic of philosophy, which is not true. He's a selective critic. And often he's critiquing falsafa from a kalam point of view, and kalam is also very philosophical. So it's more like, a Marxist attacking capitalist economic theory than it is like someone saying, oh, I don't think we should do economic theory at all. Right? It's like one kind of philosophy against another kind of philosophy.
How do you get to the knowledge? Yeah, that's what, whether through religion, reason, fate, and conflict is probably there.
Yeah, although I think not even that, because kalam is also thoroughly rational. So it's more like everyone agrees we should be using reason. The question is, where does it, which arguments are the right ones, right? And I mean, there's also the role of mysticism in Ghazali, which complicates matters. But basically, he's attacking Ibn Sina's rational philosophy with rational arguments of his own. That's the project. So that's why I'm saying it's more like a philosophical critique of a philosophical system than anything else. So that's one thing people get wrong about Ghazali. The other thing is that they, for some reason, they think, well, he just sort of like banished philosophy, which would be an incredible thing to achieve if someone could do it. But this is not true at all. So as I've said, we have century upon century of people doing philosophy within a broadly Avicennan framework, either for him or against him, or a mixture of both. And Ghazali, in a way, is just kind of the first person or the most prominent early person to do this. But then other people are doing it in a more or less critical way. And then some people are totally defending Ibn Sina as well. So it depends.
I hope you're finding this conversation interesting, and if so, please subscribe or follow on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts to get notified about future episodes. Please also leave a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps the channel reach more people. Now back to the conversation. What happens after 12th century, if you can provide us some, because I think you also already mentioned Ottoman Empire, Safavids, Mughal Empire, these gunpowder empires. So do we see decline in the intellectual curiosity across these regions, or
No. I mean, what you do see is you see a big social and political catastrophe, which is that the Mongols sweep through.
Yeah.
Okay. But the Mongols actually then hire some of the philosophers and scientists to do their stuff at their courts. Like there's this philosopher named Nasir-ad-Din Tusi who works for the new Mongol rulers by running an observatory for them. And he writes commentaries defending Ibn Sina from his detractors, right? That's actually a bit earlier than, so the Ottoman, Safavids, Mughals, that's another couple of hundred years later, right? So there's this kind of middle period, let's say 13th, 14th, 15th century, which is extremely badly researched still, unfortunately, especially the 14th and 15th century. We have a pretty good sense of what's happening in the 12th and 13th century now. And that's a pretty new development in the field. So at least in European languages, like when I was a grad student, nobody knew anything about this really, at least in terms of what was being written in European languages. In the Islamic world, I think people had a better idea. So people writing in Arabic and Persian and Turkish and so on. But now also in European languages, we have quite a lot of work being done on 12th and 13th century. The 14th and 15th century are still not quite as well researched, but we know that there's a vast amount of philosophical literature there. And a lot of it consists of commentary traditions that somehow have something to do with Ibn Sina. So they're either commentaries on Ibn Sina himself or on people who were commenting on him, or they're commentaries on works by people like Tusi, for example. Or there's a logician named Katibi who writes this work that becomes a kind of standard textbook in logic, and people comment on that. And so you have this philosophical commentary culture, which then proceeds for a couple of hundred years and then feeds into the three empires. So you have Ottoman Empire, Safavid Empire, Mughal Empire, and you have unbroken lines of commentary traditions that go back to this kind of late medieval period. So that's really what's happening in the post-classical era.
Yeah, I guess 12th and 13th century is kind of interesting because you have Seljuk invasions and then Mongol invasions, probably kind of an earthquake for the Islamic world. And you have this sacking of Baghdad in 1258, where
Yeah, right.
that the river was in ink rather than blood. So it was a metaphor.
And they rolled this caliph in a carpet and had him trampled to death by horses. I mean, actually, this is kind of funny, right? Because if you thought that philosophy sort of dies out after let's say the 13th century, you're sort of looking around for a culprit, right? And you've got, I mean, one of the most shattering political events in world history, the Mongol invasions. And then you're like, no, I think it was probably Ghazali writing one book a century and a half earlier. That's probably what did the damage. So again, this is, I mean, to be honest, this is quite stupid, once you think about it. So about as stupid as what Russell said, but it's a very well entrenched myth about philosophy in the Islamic world, sort of blaming Ghazali for sticking the knife into philosophy and killing it off. And then the last philosopher is supposed to be Ibn Rushd, who's like reacting against Ghazali, but it's a dying flame, and he's trying to sort of keep it burning, and then it's extinguished in the Islamic world, but it's carried on by the Europeans. Of course, it's a very pro-European narrative, right? Because the idea would be that Islamic superstition killed off philosophy, and they lost the ability to think philosophically because they were no longer interested in Aristotle, right? But thank goodness the rational Europeans kept going, and then we're often running to the Enlightenment, right? So this is, quite foolish. And I think the thing that kind of triggers it is a couple of things. One is that it is true that they stopped thinking about Aristotle in the East for the most part, but that's because they're thinking about Ibn Sina, who's broadly Aristotelian, but is kind of a new thing. So they're doing lots and lots of philosophy, but it's in an Avicennan framework rather than an Aristotelian framework, whereas Aristotelian in the broad sense that if Avicennism is in a way Aristotelian, but in a way not. But I think the other thing, and this is what would have misled someone like Russell very badly, is that if you're in Europe in the early 20th century and you're kind of looking at what there is in terms of philosophy from the Islamic world, you're going to be very influenced by the medieval translations from Arabic into Latin, which happened around the end of the 12th century, right? So by definition, anything that was written after the end of the 12th century would not have been translated. Also, even a lot of what was written in the 12th century, that like really interesting philosophers like Fakhruddin Arazi and Abu Barakat al-Baghdadi and Suhrawardi, these are the three great philosophers of the 12th century in the Islamic world. None of them were translated into Latin because they're out in the East, right? And the translations are happening in the West. So there's a kind of blindness in European historiography because they think, well, what is philosophy in the Islamic world? Well, it's whatever was translated into Latin. And lo and behold, it ends in the late 12th century. And after that, philosophy is dead. Well, why? Because the Latin translation movement happened in the late 12th century. So it's a kind of self-fulfilling prophecy. And once you see that, you realize how foolish it is, right?
Yeah.
Because of course you don't know anything about post 12th century philosophy because you're looking at Latin translations that were made in the 12th century, right? Like duh. But I think it's taken the field a while to get its mind around that, and it's taking even longer for the popular conception to reorient itself, which is why I like coming on shows like this and explaining it, because I'm trying to get as many people as possible to understand that this is just like an optical illusion created by the Latin translation movement.
Yeah, it's a great experience. Yep. Also, okay, since you already touched upon the translation movement, so maybe I can shift towards that. So if this translation movement didn't happen, let's say if these translators didn't translate Aristotle's or other thinkers' works from ancient world to the Latin, what would the history of philosophy would look like today?
I love that question because this is actually something I always say, is that let's take your thought experiment. So imagine there's no Greek-Arabic translation movement. So then we go into Arabic literature or literature from the Islamic world, and we're looking for the philosophy part, right? So what is the thing we find that's most philosophical? Then we would just think kalam was philosophy in the Islamic world. Because kalam is, some people think that there's some influence of Greek and maybe Christian theological ideas via Greek into Arabic. But basically, kalam is its own thing. And it doesn't come out of the Greek Arabic translation movement for sure. And it's a rational engagement with problems arising from Islam, right? Much as Christian scholastic theology, like an Aquinas or Scotus, someone like that, is a rational engagement with problems arising out of Christian revelation, right? So they're worrying about things like what are the conditions under which someone can be morally responsible and held responsible by God and the Last Judgment? How does creation work? Can you prove that God is a creator? Can you prove that Muhammad was a prophet? What is prophecy? How does it work? What's the epistemology of prophecy, as it were? They also have their own physics. So the Kalam is usually atomist. So they think that created things are substances, atomic substances. that have properties associated with them by God. So they have the whole physics. So they've got a moral theory, they've got political theory, they've got an epistemology, they have arguments about the nature of knowledge and how to define it, for example. They talk about the role of sensation in epistemology. They talk about free will. They talk about the nature of God, whether you can prove God, and on and on and on, right? So they actually cover the full range of philosophical topics pretty much. And again, there's a kind of optical illusion created by the fact that we also have this thing called falsafa, right? Which is the direct engagement with Greek philosophy, as I said before. And since it's obvious that we should translate falsafa as philosophy, people then translate kalam as something like rational theology. And it is theological. I don't want to deny that. I mean, they're always motivated by handling some kind of problem that arose out of the revelation. So that's true. But they shift very quickly to talking about philosophy because they basically are trying to resolve these problems by saying, okay, well, if we want to know, does God have to allow human freedom in order to punish and reward people justly? Well, if we're gonna figure that out, we better figure out what freedom is, and we better figure out the grounds of moral responsibility. And so then they get into some completely rational discussion of those philosophical issues in order to sort out their theological concerns.
Let's take two people, Plato and Aristotle. Yep. So the Plato and Aristotle that we refer to today isn't the same Plato and Aristotle that existed, and which is not the same Plato and Aristotle that Arabs understood, which is probably not the same Plato and Aristotle that they preserved. So I was wondering if you can comment on that aspect. Like when they preserve these original texts, Arabs, do they selectively pick and choose, or they just take a look whatever that is available to them, or what's happening in that
So
respect?
it varies a lot by Greek author. So actually the cases of Plato and Aristotle are very sharply contrasting. So the straightforward case is Aristotle. They basically translate everything they can get their hands on. And the translations are very accurate by the middle of the 10th century. There are even multiple translations for some works, which they considered important. They tried to really get it right. And so let's say Farabi in the early middle of the 10th century CE, he could read almost everything by Aristotle that we can read. Not everything, but almost everything. And in fairly reliable translations. By contrast, Plato, they didn't have a single complete translation of any Platonic dialogue, as far as we know. What they did have was translations of summaries of Plato by Galen. And the reason they translated those is that they were fascinated by Galen's medicine, so they wanted to translate everything by him. And because he wrote paraphrases of Plato, they seem to have translated at least some of his paraphrases. Actually, we've got one of them. We've got his paraphrase of the Timaeus in Arabic. And it looks like there's a paraphrase of Plato's late dialogue, The Laws, which is the basis for another paraphrase by Farabi, which is probably a summary of Galen's summary of the Laws. So those are very different cases. And it's interesting that they chose to translate Aristotle and not Plato. I mean, we can get into that if you want. Then there's a third option. So you see this very strongly with a philosopher named Plotinus. So he's 3rd century CE. He's the founder of Neoplatonism. This was my PhD thesis was about, actually. So when they translate Plotinus, they completely rework the text by adding a whole bunch of material and also translating it in a way that bends and reconsiders the actual text. So it really is a kind of new philosophical work that's based on Plotinus rather than a summary or a straight translation. So these are kind of 3 options. You have case like just the nice option where they just translate everything very neatly. That's Aristotle or Galen usually. You have the kind of, well, they're not really very up to speed on it, but they maybe have some reports or paraphrases. That's Plato. And then you have this really interesting case where they've completely reworked the source text.
Were they familiar with the political philosophy of Plato and Aristotle, or it wasn't available?
So again, it looks like they had a paraphrase of the Republic.
Okay.
And the Laws. I already mentioned the Laws. So Ibn Rushd wrote a paraphrase of Plato's Republic, which must be based on Galen's paraphrase of the Republic. And he says something interesting about it, which is that he didn't have access to Aristotle's Politics, and so he wrote a paraphrase of this work instead as a kind of replacement. It's kind of strange thing to do. It's actually not clear. One of the works where there's the most controversy about whether it was available is Aristotle's Politics. So that's a matter of scholarly dispute. I guess I'm skeptical that they had it, but we're not sure.
Why Islamic world scholars in the Islamic world were so obsessed with Aristotle?
Okay, well, first of all, he's Aristotle, so I mean, you should be obsessed with him. But there's also a historical explanation which goes back before the rise of Islam to late antiquity. So imagine that you're a philosophy student and it's the 5th century. So where would you be studying and what would you be studying? Well, ideally, you would go to Alexandria, the city in Egypt, and you would enroll in one of the schools there. And at the school, you would start with Aristotelian logic, and then you would move through other works of Aristotle. And that would kind of be your undergraduate philosophy degree. And then if you were really advanced, you might move on and kind of do doctoral work, and then you could start reading Plato. So it's because these guys were Platonists, so they thought Plato was sort of more advanced and divine than Aristotle. And so you would graduate from kind of baby stuff, which is Aristotle, to the grown-up stuff, which is Plato. And actually, when I say baby, I almost mean that literally. Like, the students here are very young. I don't know if they would have been as young as at medieval universities, but medieval university students were teenagers, actually, like junior high school students, that kind of age, and high school students. And we might be talking about that here as well. I mean, their first thing they had to do was learn to read and write, and then once they've done that, they can start studying some basic Aristotelian logic, and then they move on to physics and ethics and so on. So the result of that is, just like if you go into a bookshop now, you see a lot of books that are kind of for introductory students and on basic stuff, and you wouldn't find as many books on more advanced things, right? So similarly, especially if it's a small bookshop. And similarly, when the people who were doing the translation movements wanted to sort of find what was key and really fundamental in Greek philosophy, they naturally go for Aristotle. And this already happens before the rise of Islam in another Semitic language, which is called Syriac. So there are already translations of Aristotle's logic and commentaries on Aristotle's logic in Syriac. And that basically paves the way for the Arabic translation movement. A lot of the people who translate from Greek into Arabic are Syrians. They're Greek-speaking Christians from Syria, and they can translate from Greek into Syriac and Syriac into Arabic. And in fact, sometimes they would translate, even if they have the Greek text, they would sometimes translate that into Syriac and then translate the Syriac into Arabic, which shows you how deeply embedded Syriac was in the kind of scholarly traditions of Syria in that whole story. And so Christians became the really fundamental group who were involved with transmitting Greek philosophy into the Islamic world.
All right. All right. So we have these people translating and retaining the originality and everything. But we also, on the other hand, we have the Eastern Roman Empire, which is home to Greek and Greece and all these original sites. So what are they doing that is not that we haven't captured, or do we see any similar translation, any similar preservation movement in that part of the world?
Yeah, I mean, of course, in a way, anything we can read in Greek, by definition, was available in Constantinople in the Middle Ages, because if it hadn't been, it would be lost, right? So a very few philosophical texts from antiquity that don't come through the Byzantine manuscript tradition, but hardly any. There are things like, stuff they dug out of Herculaneum, were covered in ash, right? Or there's a couple of philosophical works that are in stone inscriptions or in papyri that were discovered buried in the sands of Egypt, that kind of thing. But 95% or more of Greek philosophy survives in Greek because it was preserved in the Byzantine tradition. So obviously they don't have to translate it because they're still using Greek, right? I mean, it's Greek-speaking Roman Empire. And there's, I think, an underappreciated amount of intellectual interchange between the Byzantines and the Muslims as well. So obviously they're fighting wars all the time. But in addition to fighting wars, if you want a Greek manuscript, where you're going to get it? Well, from the Byzantines, right? And also, as I said, there's this surviving Greek-speaking scholarly culture in Syria, which was under Byzantine domination, and the Muslims come in and take it over. So there's a lot of interweaving between these two cultures. And you even have some reception of Arabic scientific works in Greek in Byzantine, basically in Constantinople. So, I think the two things to know there are, first of all, that we're dependent on the Constantinople, the Byzantine manuscript tradition for almost everything we know about Greek philosophy, and that there was quite a bit of interchange between the Greek Christian world and the Arabic-speaking Muslim world. And without that, you would never have had the translation movement into Arabic.
Do we have any evidence whether scholars in the Islamic world were interested in pre-Socratic philosophers such as Anaximander, Thales, Heraclitus, or was it hidden from their sight?
No, they know these names, and they know them in part for the reason we do, which is that Aristotle talks about them, right? So actually, Aristotle is one of our most important sources for knowledge about the Pre-Socratics. What they probably did not have is the most useful commentaries on Aristotle. So there are commentaries by a late ancient scholar named Simplicius, who wrote these massive commentaries on the categories and the physics. And especially the physics commentary is important here, because that's a text where Aristotle says a lot about Pre-Socratics. And then Simplicius is like 5th, 6th century, by the way. So Simplicius then says, oh, well, here he's talking about Parmenides. And these days it's very hard to find a copy of Parmenides' poem. So here it is. And he gives you a quotation of Parmenides, like, thank you, Simplicius. Without him, we wouldn't have most of what we've got from Parmenides is from Byzantine manuscript copies of Simplicius's commentary on Aristotle's physics. Okay. We actually do have some sources of information about the Pre-Socratics that were not available in Arabic. So actually Simplicius probably wasn't available, although that's not totally clear either. But also the church fathers, like early Christian theologians writing in Greek, they say a fair amount about the Pre-Socratics, which is very useful. And of course, they didn't have that in the Islamic world. So mostly what they know about the Pre-Socratics comes directly from Aristotle. They also have some collections that are like wise sayings that were put together by someone who wanted to make a compilation of wisdom literature in Greek culture. And then they've got that translated into Arabic. So in particular, there's this compilator named Aetius, who wrote a kind of a sort of treasury of Greek wisdom, which was translated into Arabic. And Aetius is actually a very important source of information for Pre-Socratics. How widely that text would have been known, though, I don't know. I think mostly someone like Ibn Sina or Ibn Rushd, when they're talking about the Pre-Socratics, they would almost certainly be almost entirely dependent on Aristotle for what they knew.
Yeah, treasure of Greek wisdom. Such an interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, if we jump across centuries again, which we have been doing so far, also there is something interesting about the geopolitical history of Middle East and Central Asia. Yes, because you have people like Genghis Khan and even Tamerlane. I mean, I checked the book recently, and it was called "Lost Enlightenment: Central Asia's Golden Age from the Arab Conquest to Tamerlane" by Frederick Starr. So even in 16th century, 15th century, there's some evidence that in these parts of the world we had, as it's called, lost enlightenment.
One way to seek legitimacy in the pre-modern world is to have a bunch of scholars at your court, right? It's also practically advantageous, right? So having a few scientists on your side is never a bad idea. What if you get sick? You're going to need a doctor, right? And in fact, Ibn Sina, to go back to him briefly, his career consists of moving around from one sort of local warlord to another. and he always attaches himself to them as their court doctor.
Mm.
And they might also appreciate that he's a philosopher, but it's really him being a doctor that they most value. So, and then you have like astronomers like Tuzi, who I mentioned before. Um, Sometimes people who are interested in astronomy also say they can do astrology, which was perceived as very useful. I mean, if you thought you could tell the future, that would be pretty useful, right? So there are a lot of reasons why political rulers were willing to offer patronage to philosophers. It kind of made them look good, and then it had these side benefits as well. And so a lot of people did it, even people we might be surprised at. So, like, for example, one of the Abbasid caliphs during Al-Kindi's lifetime in the 9th century was a real sort of warmonger kind of dude, but he still supported philosophers at his court. So that's really very common. And you, of course, see that. I mean, later on, you'll see it with things like, you know, the Medicis in Renaissance Italy do the same thing for the same reason. Although the Medicis have a lot less blood on their hand than Tamerlane or Genghis Khan. I think the question is, how are you going to make a living as a philosopher, right? So, I mean, you've proven the existence of God. Congratulations. I mean, how are you going to put food on the table, right? And there aren't too many options, right? So one is that you happen to be independently wealthy, which would have been true of Kindi, actually. But even Kindi is always trying to get patrons to support the translation activity because that's expensive. Hiring these guys to translate is expensive. So anyway, that's one option is you have rich people. There's like later on, there's this Persian prince named Dada Shikoh who writes about how Indian ancient wisdom and Islamic Sufism are the same fundamentally. And of course, he's rich because he's a prince, right? And you can think of examples of this in the European tradition as well, right? So people who are aristocrats and don't need money. So that's an option. But another option would be supporting yourself through patronage, which is what Ibn Sina did and what a lot of them did. Actually, Kindi is both, right? Al-Farabi also sought patronage in his lifetime. So that's very common. Or you can make a living doing something that's kind of ancillary to your philosophical work. So, for example, we know of philosophers who made a living as a scribe, in other words, copying out manuscripts by hand, or as a doctor. That's very common. And I mean, they're like being a professional doctor often has to do with patronage because it's really some rich guy who's paying you, right? It's hard to make a living as a doctor, sort of, ministering to peasants, right? That's not going to work. And then eventually in the Islamic world, you do get the establishment of these madrasas that I mentioned before. And that is game changing because once you have these institutions, just as with universities, I mean, in a way, this is how I make a living, right? So I teach at a madrasa. It's called the LMU, the Ludwig Maximilians Universität in Munich, is basically a madrasa, right? So it's a university. It's an institution of learning where you have people who get a salary to teach there and do research. And this is exactly what is going on. Like, philosophers in the 14th century are being paid to teach at madrasas that were set up before the Mongols and survived the Mongol invasions because they're very useful to have, right? You want to educate your population, have people who are literate, able to do mathematics, that kind of thing. And the madrasas is how they did that. And it's a parallel development. Again, gets started a bit earlier, but it's a parallel development to what you see in the Latin Christian sphere with the founding of the universities and so on.
What's it like to be student in madrasa, let's say in 9th century in Baghdad?
Well, the madrasas are later, right? So the madrasas come in around the end of the 11th century. So you can't do that in the 9th century.
Let's go to the 12th century, all right.
Yeah, 12th century. So it would, I mean, I think to some extent, we don't know, right? So you kind of have to reconstruct on the basis of the nature of the texts and so on. But it's a pretty stable educational tradition. And even today, there are madrasas in the Islamic world where people are educated in this way. So the fundamental idea is that you study a set text with a master. So you would, so for example, I mentioned before this logician named Katibi. So he wrote a work called Kitab al-Shamsiyya. Shamsiyya is actually an allusion to the patron for whom he wrote it, Shamsuddin. So that illustrates the point about patronage. So once it beds in as a text that everyone needs to study, it means that, like, let's say you're the professor, I'm the student. So I would come to the madrasa, and with probably a small group of other students, I would memorize the text, probably be able to recite it by word, word for word. And then you would have me at your office hours, you would say, okay, here's a sentence. Tell me what it means and what other people have said about it.
Mm.
Okay. And that's why we have, I remember I said before that there is like this very commentary
All right.
driven culture. The reason that this is the commentaries are written in order to help students do this. So it's like, here's what you have to know about this sentence in Katibi. And then you get maybe 2 pages of explanation. You don't maybe have to memorize the commentary, but you have to memorize the sentence in the source text. And you need to be prepared to kind of recite what the positions are, the different interpretations and problems and solutions that arise from it. And you even get commentaries on commentaries. You even get commentaries on commentaries on commentaries, and so on. You also have a tradition. So they distinguish between a commentary, which is a sharh or tafsir, but usually sharh, and a hawashi, which means gloss. So a gloss would be like not a full commentary, but just notes in a margin. And again, you might then write a commentary on someone's glosses, or you might write a gloss on someone's commentary, etc. And this is how they teach and how they learn. So it's all about rote memorization plus understanding this whole tradition of dialogue about the text. And it's actually a very interesting way to think about philosophy. So for them, philosophy is kind of a set of key texts that generate a set of key issues, interpretive and philosophical problems. And then you have this increasingly complex accretion of commentators who have addressed this, and you're supposed to master all that. And once you've done that, you convince them. So you're the professor, right? I convince you that I have mastered this work by Katabi, and then you actually give me a document with a seal on it and everything that says, I studied this with you and I'm now qualified to teach it myself.
Mm.
So it's like a diploma. And my diploma will actually list all of the people I've studied with and which works I have studied with them, which I'm now qualified to teach, which is really important because it means that we actually have these documents. And sometimes people say, okay, this is my lineage, right? And you'll have someone say, okay, I studied with so-and-so, he studied with so-and-so, and back and back and back. And he studied with Ibn Sina. So I'm like a 9th generation student of Ibn Sina.
That's how
Right?
you would flex in the academia back
That's how
then.
you would flex, except that everyone can say that because Ibn Sina's like everyone's trying to trace their lineage back to these famous people.
It seems to be there is a great emphasis on the commentary aspect. Yes,
Yeah,
kind of seems similar to how they interpreted religious texts as well. Yes, like that. There is this text that you have, and there is like 100 interpretations, and your job is to
Mm, yeah,
understand them,
so
evaluate them, and
yeah,
memorize.
I mean, I think the difference is that there's a difference between a school text and the Quran, right? So you're right that there's this parallel development of commentary tradition on the Quran, and you have super commentaries on the Quran as well. So super commentary means a commentary on a commentary, right? Uh, but I think one thing that tends to happen with the school texts is that their interests will sometimes drift away from what was going on in the source text because you get such a complicated commentary tradition that it generates whole new problems. And then sometimes people actually write new source texts, right? It's like, okay, we need to rethink all this. Here's another textbook. And then if you succeed, what happens is that the generations to come use your new textbook and start commenting on that as well. And something that shows just how deeply embedded this way of doing philosophy was, and not just philosophy, this happens in other fields like the language sciences and jurisprudence and so on, and kalam. But in philosophy and these other disciplines, sometimes people will write a very short work, short enough to be memorized, and they'll write their own commentary on it. So here's what I wrote, here's what it means. And without the commentary, you actually can't tell what's going on in the source text. So they kind of try to control how you interpret their own work.
What can we say about the significance of Omar Khayyam?
Oh, okay. That's a little bit of a left field question. So he's an interest. So people think of him as a literary figure, right? Poet. And that's how I always thought of him too. But it turns out that he also wrote some technical works on philosophy. So he wrote several short treatises on the topic of existence. And he turns out to be a fairly innovative figure in the debates over the meaning of Ibn Sina's philosophy of existence, which is quite surprising. So he would be a good example of someone who is sort of, like getting into philosophy probably because of the way he was educated. But of course, that's not his primary vocation. One could also think of Rumi, the great Persian mystical poet, who also knows his philosophy quite well, but isn't very convinced by it.
Last question. You have a great podcast called History of Philosophy Without Any Gaps. I would recommend everyone to go listen to it. I think you summarize all these ideas very nicely. And you have been doing this for a long time. So,
Yeah, true.
which gap are you trying to close now after all those
Oh,
episodes?
wow. Well, so actually, this morning I recorded episodes 498 and 499. So I'm basically done with 500 episodes. And those are about Pierre Bayle, who's a French philosopher. He was a Protestant who had to flee to Holland, lived in Rotterdam. So he's like a turn of the 18th century French philosopher. So that's how far I am with European philosophy. And in alternating weeks, I release episodes on European philosophy and non-European philosophy. So in the non-European series, I always do this with co-authors. And we've covered classical Indian philosophy, Africana philosophy, and now we're doing classical Chinese philosophy. And once we're done with classical Chinese philosophy, we're going to be moving on to do later Chinese philosophy. So we'll cover Chinese philosophy from the Warring States period up till the 19th century or so eventually. That's the plan. But I hope that eventually it will include at least some coverage of philosophy from pretty much the whole world. So I want to do Japan and Korea, later Indian philosophy, Latin American philosophy, you name it. But this will depend a little bit on how long I live and things like that.
If you can discover some lost works of Aristotle, Plato, or something else, please cover them so we can also.
Oh God, no! Please no. I I don't have time for that. I can't go back. I
Peter,
can go
thank you
forward.
so much. It's been great
Thank you.
talking to you so
Thanks for
far.
having me.
This was a very nice conversation. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening or watching. If you want to stay updated on future episodes, you can follow the channel on YouTube, Spotify, or Apple. Please also consider leaving a like on YouTube or a review on Spotify, as this helps the channel reach more people. And feel free to leave a comment if you have any personal thoughts on the topics we discussed. More conversations and solo episodes are on the way in the coming weeks, and following the channel is the best way to be notified about them. You can reach out to me on every social media platform with links included in the description. Thanks again for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.